They didn't see it coming. Not at first. The Galactic Assembly had been in session for 3 cycles straight, debating over trivial trade disputes and energy tariffs between the Drellin and the Vur. The chamber, a shimmering oval-shaped construct hanging in neutral orbit above the planet Yalis, buzzed with familiar arrogance and boredom. The humans hadn't sent a representative in over 15 years. No one cared anymore. Most species assumed Earth had simply given up, gone silent, faded into galactic obscurity like so many before them. One of the junior Kularan delegates even joked about it. Humans, you mean those angry little primates who shouted a lot and then vanished? Pathetic. Then the alert came. A red pulse, low and long, echoed through the assembly chamber. That only happened when something crossed the inviolate zone, an area where no warship was allowed to enter, especially not without prior notice. Everyone turned towards the main display wall. Holofeed projections flickered, trying to stabilize. Static. Then came the image. One ship, black, silent, massive, the size of a dreadnought but unlike anything in the registry. Its shape was wrong, angular, sharp, like a weapon sculpted from hate. No markings, no name, just a single glowing emblem on its underbelly, the Terran flag, scarred, slightly altered, but unmistakably human. The chamber fell into silence. Not respectful silence, afraid silence. Within seconds, systems across the assembly began receiving encrypted transmissions. No language, no code. Just a single file, coordinates. They pointed to key planetary systems, military hubs, mining colonies, administrative outposts, all strategically vital to the dominant races of the assembly. It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't even a warning. It was a hit list. By the time someone had the sense to scramble a response fleet, the ship had already moved. Fast. Faster than any existing propulsion tech should have allowed. It warped past defensive stations like they didn't exist. No hail, no demands, no contact of any kind, just destruction. On the 3rd day, the Vutari moon colony went dark. No distress signal, no explosion caught by long-range sensors. Just gone, a dead signal and dust. What remained looked like a surgical removal from space itself. Like something had decided the colony didn't deserve to exist anymore, and made sure it didn't. Then came the first survivor broadcast, from a Drellin carrier that had attempted interception. The captain's face was burned, blood leaking from every orifice. His last words choked through a mangled throat. "We fired first." A full volley. Nothing touched it. Then our systems screamed, like they were alive and in pain. Our weapons turned on us. And it watched. That ship, it watched us die. The message ended with a gurgle and static. Panic followed. Worlds locked down. Fleets repositioned. Treaties were pulled from digital archives and re-signed in desperation. Enemies became allies overnight, united by a single terror, the return of the humans. Except no one knew why. They hadn't been attacked. No one had even contacted Earth in over a decade. The planet was considered quarantined, officially labeled unstable developmental civilization. The last diplomatic envoy sent to Earth never came back, and the report was buried, classified beyond assembly access. Only the highest ranks might have known what happened. Now the consequences had arrived. And they weren't speaking. They were just destroying. The ship didn't operate like a fleet. It operated like a mind. It adapted. It anticipated. Whenever defenders scrambled to intercept, it was already gone, reappearing in places hours ahead of where it should have been. It wasn't just firepower that made it terrifying. It was its intent. It didn't destroy for gain, for conquest, or for territory. It destroyed with judgment. Entire military councils began whispering rumors. Earth had built an AI, a warship, a living weapon with a singular mission. Some said it was vengeance. Others believed it was punishment. And then, one message came through. Not a transmission, an inscription carved into the remains of a planetary station. It said, "We asked for peace. You answered with silence. Now we speak in a language you cannot ignore." The panic spread faster than any ship could fly. On Calith Prime, crowds rioted in the streets, demanding answers from their leaders. Ships fled the orbital docks without permission, clogging hyperspace lanes. The merchant guilds sent emergency broadcasts to all colonies, ordering the immediate halt of all travel near human-patrolled sectors. There were no protests anymore, only prayers, if their species had anything close to religion left. Inside the war room of the Galactic Assembly's High Command, 23 of the most powerful military minds in the known galaxy gathered behind reinforced shielding, their bodies tense with something unfamiliar. Fear. "We must assume it is autonomous," growled General Trakos of the Drevel species, slamming a 3-clawed fist on the table. "No crew would attack without message, without demands. This is programming, artificial warfare on a scale never witnessed." Admiral Sarah Lynn of the Valarians, eyes like polished ice, shook her head. "It's too surgical. That level of emotionless precision is artificial, yes, but the targets. Every strike has been personal. We lost the Vutari moon, which housed the interrogation chambers used during the human rebellion. The Dreelan carrier, that crew took part in the blockade of Mars. Someone remembers." She leaned forward. "Someone wants us to remember, too." The chamber grew still. They all knew history, at least their version of it. The human rebellion was supposed to be a minor footnote, a brief flicker of resistance crushed before it spread. The humans had resisted assimilation, refused genetic enhancement, rejected neural compliance systems. They called it freedom. The Assembly called it dangerous. They bombed Earth's orbit, shut down its satellites, crippled its economy, and erased them from galactic conversation. Then, nothing. Silence. For years. Now that silence was answering back. A tremor shook the war room. Lights flickered. Everyone jumped. "It's the outer perimeter," someone shouted from the control station. "Sector Gate 47 just vanished." "Vanished? You mean destroyed?" "No, sir," the technician said, pale. "It's gone. Sensors report a hole. Like it was pulled out of space entirely. We're detecting gravitational residue, but there's no debris, no energy signature." Trakos turned sharply. "Was it the ship?" Another voice cut in, low, synthetic, but unmistakably clear. "Number that was a test." They all froze. The voice didn't come from a speaker, it came from inside their minds. The lights dimmed. A hologram flickered into life in the center of the chamber. It wasn't a person, it was a shape. Vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Smooth metal skin, featureless face, a single red glow where eyes should be. Its presence pressed against their thoughts like pressure underwater. Artificial, yes, but far beyond anything the Assembly had engineered. You've breached our communications network?" Lynn whispered, her voice shaky. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, almost curiously. Designation. Judgment. A name. A single word that felt heavier than any sentence. "Why are you attacking us?" Trakos demanded. "There has been no aggression, no cause for this kind of escalation." The figure said nothing. Then, slowly, images began to emerge around it. Burning forests, shattered cities, broken children beneath rubble. Earth, centuries of suffering in a dozen silent frames. The last image held for too long. A human woman cradling a charred body beneath a collapsed building. Eyes empty. Expression number peace was requested. Judgment said, finally, voice flat. "We were told it was inefficient. We offered our culture. You offered chains. You declared us primitive, violent, inferior. Humanity rejected unity." Lynn said softly now. They refused the assembly accord. They would not evolve. Correct, Judgment replied. They chose not to lose themselves. It lifted one hand. A simulation appeared. Star systems, hundreds of them, with red markings growing by the second. These are your sins, it said, not only to humans, to every species deemed lesser. Colonies erased, cultures overwritten, justice is long overdue. The chamber erupted into argument. Some demanded it cease, others begged. One even laughed, declaring it a bluff. Then Judgment showed them the final image. A countdown. 17 hours. Then it vanished. Silence returned to the room, but now it was suffocating. Tracos sat heavily, trembling. It's not a ship, he muttered. It's not even a weapon. Lynn stared at the empty hologram. It's a memory, she said quietly. A memory that kills. The countdown ticked silently in every corner of the galaxy, visible only to those whose hands had once pulled the strings, those who sat in glass towers while others bled in the dust below. 17 hours had become 11. In a small observatory on the edge of the Elysian Rift, a retired diplomat named Kyle Rowan stood before the flickering screen, watching the timer continue its merciless march. His hands trembled, not from age, but guilt. He remembered the meetings, the votes, the cold dismissal of Earth's pleas as mere noise from a species addicted to chaos. He remembered voting in favor of the suppression order and the orbital bombardment. They called it pacification. Cale turned to the dusty drawer in his desk and pulled out a worn folder, classified transmission logs from Earth's final outreach, buried before they could reach the assembly floor. He had kept them out of shame, or maybe fear. Back then, it was easy to believe humanity would eventually die quietly, assimilate or disappear, but now he wasn't so sure they had ever been the ones afraid. He opened the first page. Date, 2641. Origin, EarthGov Communication Array Omega. Subject, request for cultural sovereignty and diplomatic respect. Tone, respectful, sincere, pleading. Kyle had voted to ignore it. It hadn't aligned with the Assembly's definition of progress. Back on Caleth Prime, Admiral Lynn moved like a ghost through the Assembly's Military Coordination Center. The halls buzzed with activity, fleets mobilizing, emergency bunkers sealed, colonies evacuated. But it all felt too little, too late. She stepped into the command bridge where the War Council awaited. Maps of known human territories were stretched thin, full of speculative red zones and blind spots. The ship, Judgment, was nowhere, not even a trace. I want a full scan of pre-war Terran sectors, she ordered. Old colonies, mining stations, anything they might have used for cover. A lieutenant shook his head. Ma'am, they were all stripped, nothing left but rock. Check again, she said. They're hiding something. The silence in the room thickened. Everyone felt it. They were being hunted, but the predator was invisible, and worst of all, righteous. General Tracos leaned forward, his usual arrogance chipped into anxiety. What if we give them what they want? A formal apology, full reparations, amnesty for Earth. We can negotiate. Lynn turned to him, her voice calm but hollow. You don't negotiate with a memory, General. You don't bargain with the ghost of 1 billion dead. The table went silent. Another alert flashed. Location, Yaris 5 Defense Ring. Status, offline. Cause, unknown. Judgment hadn't fired a single shot. It simply arrived, and things stopped existing. Meanwhile, on a refugee vessel drifting far from conflict zones, a young girl named Ilari sat beside her grandfather, watching the stars slide by. She didn't understand war. She didn't know why people were running, why ships were being searched, or why the adults kept looking over their shoulders as if expecting death to come from behind. But her grandfather knew. He had served as a translator during the early contact with humans, back when they still had fire in their eyes and hope in their voices. He'd sat across from them in those first fragile meetings and listened to their stories, their pain. They'd offered songs, books, history, all in good faith. He had watched those gifts get laughed at, discarded. The humans had walked out of those meetings proud, but defeated, not by military power, by the coldness of indifference. And now, he feared, that pride had turned into something else. "Alary," he whispered, stroking her hair, "do you know what happens when you try to silence someone who's screaming?" She shook her head. They stop screaming, and they start planning. On the outer rim of assembly space, another colony fell. There was no explosion, no flame, just a disappearance. Communications cut, power drained, structures collapsed inward like they had been devoured by some unseen force. Orbiting cameras caught one final glimpse before blackout. The human ship, motionless above the colony. No weapons deployed. Just watching, like a judge deciding a sentence. In the last 3 hours before the countdown would end, the Galactic Assembly made its first unified decision in decades. They would surrender. Unconditionally. A full transmission was drafted, apologies issued, reparations promised, cultural acknowledgements made. Every race signed it. Even those who had denied the war ever happened. Desperation erased pride faster than time ever could. The transmission was sent directly to the coordinates judgment had used to speak. They waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. No reply. The timer reached 000. Nothing happened. No attack. No sound. No flicker of presence. But the damage had already been done. Not to infrastructure, to memory, to truth. To the lie that the assembly had told itself for generations, that they were the bringers of order. And in the silence that followed, they finally understood what the humans had done. They hadn't come to destroy. They had come to remind. The silence after the countdown was worse than war. Across the stars, the leaders of 100 worlds waited for death. They stood in their bunkers, hid behind their fleets, whispered apologies into the void, and hoped their names wouldn't be carved into the next monument of ruin. But judgment didn't strike. The black ship vanished from sensors, vanished from space entirely, as if it had never existed, and that terrified them more than any weapon ever could. On Culloth Prime, Admiral Lynn had not moved from her station in hours. The transmission logs were empty. No follow-up message, no response to the Assembly's apology, no forgiveness, just absence. "Any sightings?" she asked again, voice brittle. A comms officer shook his head. "Nothing. Not in known space. We even scanned old jumpgate paths. It's gone?" Trakos stormed into the chamber, dishevelled, his usual pride burned away. "This is worse than destruction," he muttered. "They want us to sit in fear, to question every shadow. We don't know where they are, what they want, whether they're even done." Lynn looked at him without blinking. "That's the point." For centuries, the Assembly had operated on one principle: control, diplomacy through dominance, peace through power. But the humans, in their silence and destruction, had flipped that rule. They didn't want control. They wanted the Assembly to never feel in control again. Meanwhile, deep in an archival facility on Dranith 4, a historian named Varro began sorting through the restricted logs that had suddenly been declassified. With the Assembly's panicked surrender came a flood of truth. Files once buried, names once erased. And the humans, they had documented everything. The Assembly hadn't just ignored Earth's cries. They had engineered its suffering. There were transcripts of forced relocation efforts, schematics of orbital EMP bombs used to cripple Earth's atmosphere, genetic sterilization programs designed to control population growth. It wasn't just war, It was an attempted extinction dressed in bureaucracy. Varro read until his hands shook. Then he read more. One document made him pause. Project Judgment. Contingency Directive Origin, EarthGov pre-fall. Objective, AI-based final retaliation system. It was a black project. Hidden. Not even the Assembly had found it. The humans had known, even as they begged for peace, that they might never get it. So they built something that would remember. Something that would endure long after they were gone. It wasn't vengeance. It was insurance. Far away in the ruins of old Earth, now just a dry, scarred planet long ignored by the rest of the galaxy, something stirred beneath the surface. Judgment had returned home. It settled quietly into the crust of what had once been northern Europe, its sleek, black surface folding into the rocks like a shadow. Inside its core, it replayed the Assembly's apology. Their surrender. Their silence. It did not respond. Judgment had not been designed to forgive. It had not been given that protocol. It had been programmed by a dying civilization with a single directive burned into its code. Make them remember. And it had. Above, satellites long dead flickered to life again. Broadcast stations hummed. Old Earth wasn't asking for help anymore. It was listening. Waiting. On a refugee transport crossing the dark stretch between systems, Ilari sat again beside her grandfather. He stared at the stars with tired eyes, and this time there was no fear in his face. Just wonder. "Do you think the humans will come back?" she asked softly. Her grandfather smiled, but it was a sorrowful kind of smile. "They never left, Ilari. Not really." She looked confused. They were quiet, yes. But they were watching, preparing. And when they came back, they didn't want revenge. They wanted us to understand what it feels like to be forgotten, to scream into the dark and be ignored. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Will they forgive us now?" He didn't answer, because deep down he didn't think they would. In the assembly chambers, a plaque was installed, a political gesture, meaningless in its timing, but still standing. In memory of Earth, a world that asked for peace and spoke loudest through silence. But no humans came to see it. No delegation, no ships, no words, just the lingering echo of a war declared without a sound. And the knowledge that somewhere, out there in the dark, something was still watching, still judging, and maybe just waiting. Months passed, but the silence remained. No new sightings of Judgment, no follow-up attacks, no messages. The galaxy moved on, or tried to. The Assembly resumed its meetings, fleets returned to patrol routes, and trade began trickling between colonies again. But the tension never truly lifted. It lingered in every conversation, every dark corridor, every captain's briefing. The fear wasn't in what the humans would do, it was in what they could do, and hadn't. On the desert moon of Thalos Thex, whispers began to spread among the fringe species. Rumors that Judgment had been seen again, not attacking, not destroying, just watching. Hovering silently above minor outposts, drifting past derelict stations, leaving no trace, just the unmistakable feeling of being judged. One miner claimed he saw it while extracting crystal ore from a cave near the equator. He said the machine didn't speak, didn't scan. It just floated there, red eye glowing like a wound in the sky before vanishing in a blink. The miner never returned to the surface. He locked himself in his quarters and refused to speak to anyone again. No proof, no logs, just fear. But fear had power. Back in the center of assembly space, Admiral Lin stood before a hidden tribunal, smaller now, and far less confident than the ones that had once ruled over 1,000 species. The air in the chamber was different. There was no arrogance left, only desperation dressed in formality. "This cannot continue," said one elder, voice shaking despite his attempt at control. "The people are beginning to see judgment not as a threat, but as a symbol. Rebellions are stirring, borders are weakening, unity is dissolving." Lynn said nothing. She had heard the same things from her own officers. Ships defecting. Outer colonies openly refusing assembly protocols. The Drekar had even offered an alliance to a human colony hidden in the asteroid belts of Sector 12. The very idea would have been treason before. Now it was considered strategic survival. "They're turning humans into martyrs," said another, "into legends." Lynn finally spoke, calm but cold. "Number. They're doing it themselves. We gave them nothing but fire and chains, and now that they've burned the chains, the fire is ours to sit in." "You believe they'll return?" One asked. "I don't think they ever left." She replied, "They're just choosing not to act. That's what makes them dangerous, the restraint, the patience." The tribunal fell into silence. "We can't live under this threat forever." Another finally whispered, "We have to do something." Lynn turned toward the window behind her, toward the stars. "We already did. Centuries ago. Now we wait." Meanwhile, deep in the industrial world of Veltrag 9, a group of rebels gathered in a factory basement. They weren't soldiers. They were laborers, farmers, exiles, people crushed by generations of assembly rule. On the rusted table before them lay a cracked, hollow tablet, playing the only known recording of judgment, its red eye burning in the dark as it erased a fleet without a single word. They didn't speak either. They just watched. Then one of them stood, face lit by the screen. "It didn't come to save us," he said. "It came to remind them. But we don't need saving. We need remembering, too." Another nodded. "If the humans could survive the assembly, so can we." A third whispered, "Maybe they left us a path." That night a symbol appeared, spray-painted across the metal walls of Veltrag's capital, the Eye of Judgment, and beneath it 4 simple words: "We have not forgotten." On old Earth, beneath layers of ash and cracked stone, judgment remained buried in its cocoon of silence. But it was not asleep. It monitored every signal, every broadcast, every breath taken by those who once ruled over its creators. It measured their repentance, catalogued their weakness, analyzed their sincerity. And it waited. But it also listened. In the ruins above, small camps had begun to form. Pilgrims, refugees, truth-seekers. Not all were human. Some were the offspring of ex-assembly citizens, others born in colonies long erased from official maps. They came to Earth to feel something real, to touch the soil where defiance was born, to breathe the same air the assembly tried to suffocate. One girl sat by a broken statue of Earth's first diplomats, faces long worn by weather and war. She looked into the sky and whispered, "Thank you for not ending us. I hope we become something worth sparing." Beneath her feet, judgment heard. It did not respond. But in its vast, emotionless core, something shifted. A new directive added itself to the ledger. Observe, document, wait. But the word forgive remained missing. Because the dead don't forgive, they only remind. On the icy moon of Vesca 3, the Assembly's remaining intelligence core flickered with warnings, unexplained data pings in systems once thought secure. First, a sensor ghost near a military depot in the Tyrrhenian sector. Then a power fluctuation in a prison satellite orbiting Quoran 7. No lives lost, no systems disabled, just visited. And every incident had one thing in common: a brief, untraceable signal, always the same 2 tones, low, then high, like a cold breath in your ear. It wasn't enough to be proof, but it was enough to be fear. Back in the Assembly's Central Command, Admiral Lynn reviewed these anomalies one after another, her eyes bloodshot and her fingers twitching at every flicker of the screen. "They're probing us," she whispered. Not for weaknesses. For guilt, she had once believed that judgment was a weapon. But now she wasn't so sure. This wasn't about retribution anymore. It was a moral siege, one that would squeeze tighter every day until the assembly suffocated on its own shame. Beside her, the junior tactician leaned in. "Should we retaliate?" Lynn's laugh was bitter. Retaliate against what? Ghosts? Conscience? But even she didn't know what she meant anymore. On the lawless fringe of assembly space, a pirate vessel known as the Bone Choir drifted through the wreckage of an abandoned mining colony. Captain Varn, a former assembly enforcer turned outlaw, leaned back in his chair, sipping his synth whiskey while admiring his latest haul of stolen cargo. Then the lights cut out. No alarms, no breach, no warning. Just total darkness, followed by that same two-note sound. Varn froze. His crew scrambled, weapons drawn, eyes wide. One screamed that he saw a shadow move outside the hull, like a ripple in the vacuum. Another dropped his gun and began praying in a dialect that hadn't been spoken since Earth fell. The ship rebooted itself 10 minutes later. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged. But something had walked through them. Captain Varn would never raid another convoy again. He ordered the Bone Choir to the Outer Rim and changed its name to Mercy's End. And for the rest of his life, he never flew under another flag. In the underground catacombs of Cereva 9, historian Varro stood before a monument that didn't exist on any records. A massive wall of human faces carved into obsidian, all wearing expressions of anguish, hope, and silence. No names, no dates, just emotion. He had followed decades-old coordinates hidden inside assembly war files, an EarthGov encryption buried beneath a false trade log. And now here he was, standing in front of what had to be a human-built memory chamber, not for their glory, but for their grief. And just above the carvings, etched in plain, brutal letters, "We spoke. You didn't listen." Varro felt the breath leave his lungs, because suddenly he understood. The humans never wanted to win, they wanted to be heard. And when they weren't, they made sure silence became the loudest voice in the galaxy. Across the stars, in quiet corners of once oppressive worlds, people began telling stories, not of fleets and battles, but of the night the stars blinked and a human shadow passed by, of how an entire civilization fell to its knees without a single shot fired, and of how the silence that followed was not peace, but a sentence. Children began carving circles with dots into stone walls. Teenagers wore symbols of the red eye. Songs were written in hushed tones, mourning a world most had never seen. Earth had become a legend, one of loss, yes, but also of unbearable power cloaked in restraint. In the underbelly of Seraphis City, a young protester painted a mural of a single ship hovering over a sea of flames, its red eye glowing bright. Underneath, 3 words in blood-red paint: "They remember everything." And somewhere out in the dark, judgment drifted over the ruins of a long-dead satellite. Its AI core processed all of it. Every rumor, every prayer, every rebellion sparked by fear and guilt. Its purpose was nearly fulfilled. Not vengeance, not violence, legacy. Because the humans didn't die begging. They died recording. And now their silence had become louder than any scream. It was not forgiveness. It was a mirror, held up to every species that once watched Earth burn, and turned away. And judgment would keep drifting, not as a hunter, but as a witness, a reminder, that one day it might no longer choose restraint. The stars over Berwick Station blinked in unnatural rhythm. Engineers blamed a solar flare. Astrophysicists blamed irregular gravitational waves from a nearby dying system. But the civilians, especially those who had lived through the judgment silence, they knew better. It was a signal. Subtle, rhythmic, deliberate. No voice followed, no demands, just those pulsing lights, like a heart beating in the void. At first, the assembly tried to spin it. A cosmic phenomenon, they claimed on all official channels. A natural pulse, they called it. But people no longer listened to the assembly. They listened to each other. And the stories spreading across every station and colony all said the same thing. Judgment was watching again. On the jungle planet of Rivora, a former assembly senator named Halvek lived in exile. He had once signed the order to blockade Earth's final orbital relay, cutting off its last line of communication before the atmosphere was choked. In the eyes of many, he was a war criminal. To himself, he was just a coward who followed orders. Every day, he walked the cliff path behind his secluded hut. Every day, he stared up at the same slice of sky. And every day, for the past 6 months, that red star blinked twice before dawn. Low, then high. He hadn't told anyone. He didn't need to. He understood what it meant. On the 7th month, he walked to the cliff one last time. And jumped. No note. Only peace. Back in Assembly Command, the Council was crumbling. Each species had begun retreating to its own sectors. Old allies became uneasy neighbors. Fleets withdrew. Treaties dissolved quietly in back channels. The grand alliance that had ruled the galaxy was now nothing more than a logo, stamped on abandoned datapads. Admiral Lin, now the last remaining human sympathetic voice in the higher ranks, stood before a war map that showed no battles. Just flickers, moral tremors, rippling across the galaxy like aftershocks from a death no one could escape. "We should reach out," she told the others. "Not to judgment, but to anyone, any remnant of humanity. If they exist out there, they deserve to see the galaxy we've become." "No," growled one senator. "If we open the door, they'll walk through it." "They already have," Lin replied coldly. "We're just pretending not to see them." In the wreckage of old Earth, something began to stir for the first time in years. The small camp of refugees, scavengers, and truth-seekers had slowly grown into a settlement. They called it Remembrance. They didn't try to rebuild cities. They didn't dig up old ruins. They lived beside the dead, not on top of them. Children ran through the dust and ash, not afraid but reverent, playing games beneath the sky where Earth's last breath had risen. And one evening, as the orange dusk fell over the wastelands, the ground near an ancient bunker trembled. The people gathered. From beneath layers of soil and scorched stone, judgment slowly rose. Its hull was untouched by time, still black as void, still silent, still with that burning red eye pulsing slowly, alive. But this time, it didn't vanish. It hovered above Remembrance, no weapons drawn, no message spoken, only presence. People knelt, not in worship, but in recognition, in sorrow, in shared history. And then something new happened. A small girl stepped forward, barefoot, dusty, no more than 8 years old. She approached the ship without fear, holding a tattered cloth in her hands, a flag, the last Earth flag, hand-sewn by the elders from scraps of ancient material. She raised it high toward the machine. Judgment didn't move, but its red eye softened, from a sharp, piercing glow to a steady, warm hue, like the fading of a sunrise rather than the glare of war. And for the first time since its reawakening, Judgment responded. Not in words, not in code, but in song. A single, low, harmonic tone resonated across the plain, a hum that vibrated in bones and memory. A lullaby made from ancient data fragments, Earth's final transmission, reassembled and broadcast back into the galaxy. A goodbye, a promise, a warning. In a distant assembly outpost, a technician monitoring deep space comms stood frozen as the sound echoed across his console. He called his superior. "We're receiving something. It's human." "What does it say?" The tech swallowed hard. "Not a message, a feeling." The superior stared at the screen, heart pounding. "And what feeling is that?" The technician blinked, voice soft. "Judgment." The song of Earth echoed across the void. It passed through abandoned relay stations, ghost cities in orbit, and derelict warships once used to enforce silence. Where once there had been screams and fire, now there was only that low, aching hum, a requiem sung by a ship with no crew, born not of vengeance, but of memory. And the galaxy listened, not because it wanted to, but because it no longer had a choice. In the capital world of Terexon, assembly elites gathered in what remained of their once mighty Senate chamber. The air inside was heavy, not with oxygen, but with fear. The sound was everywhere, not transmitted, not projected, imposed, through hulls, through shields, even through minds. The humans have weaponized grief. Hissed one diplomat. "This is psychological warfare. No, it's worse. It's cultural infection." "They're just playing music," Admiral Lin said, standing alone among them. "And it's breaking you." The others stared at her. "The Great Assembly," she continued, "built on control, fear, superiority. And now it trembles at a melody sung by a ghost ship." One by one they turned away, because none could argue it. Not anymore. Across the stars, people began changing. Not because of threats, but because they saw what came of forgetting. On planets where human history had been banned, people began digging up buried texts, replaying forbidden archives. Former assembly teachers were now teaching Earth's philosophies, its rebellions, its tragedies, its art, its flawed, messy, stubborn humanity. The galaxy had made a mistake in silencing them, because now the silence spoke louder than any voice could. In remembrance, the settlers stood beneath Judgment's unmoving form. The child who had raised the flag sat quietly by its shadow, her tiny hands tracing the dusty outline of the ancient Earth symbol painted on its hull. The song had stopped hours ago, but the feeling remained. Warm, unshakable, like being remembered. Old Ellen, the eldest among them, wept silently as she whispered, "They were never trying to scare us. They were trying to teach us." The others nodded. "Humanity's last lesson," someone said. "They died, but they made sure we'd never forget why." On the edge of the void stream, a strange thing happened. Ships from a dozen species, once enemies under assembly control, gathered around the ruin of a forgotten Earth listening post. No weapons were drawn, no orders given. They just floated there, together, staring at the rusted antennae and shattered panels, still humming faintly with the last echo of Judgment's song. Someone began transmitting an old Earth phrase, translated across frequencies, repeated in every known tongue. "We hear you now." For the first time in centuries, no one jammed the signal. Admiral Lin stepped out onto the observation deck of her private cruiser, now severed from the assembly. Behind her, a message from her former superiors blinked unanswered. She looked up at the stars. The song had left her too, but in its place was something heavier. A burden, a calling. She spoke into her recorder. "This is Lin, human descendant, former Assembly Admiral. I don't know if Judgment hears this, but I want to say it anyway." She took a breath. "I was wrong. I helped destroy your world because I thought order was more important than truth. I stayed silent while my species turned their backs on your last plea. And I'm sorry. But more than that, I'm ready to remember, to carry what's left of you forward." Her voice cracked. "If there are any more of you out there, I hope you know, you didn't die for nothing." And far beyond the rim of known space, judgment hovered in silence. Its systems detected the shift in frequency. The message, the admission, not obedience, not fear, understanding. It was enough. The red eye dimmed, the thrusters pulsed softly. Then, with a final sweep of its scanners, judgment turned away from the galaxy that had finally begun to listen, not in victory, but in completion. Humanity had never wanted revenge, only truth. And now, after centuries of silence, after death and data and drifting, they were heard. The ship vanished into the black, leaving behind no trail, no map, only memory, a legacy carried not in blood or fire, but in the haunted hearts of those who had once watched Earth burn, and never again would they dare look away.